The clock on the factory wall read 10:45 p.m. when David finally clocked out. His shirt was soaked through with sweat, and every muscle in his body screamed for rest. But instead of heading home like his coworkers, he walked quickly toward the locker room where a different uniform waited for him. A security guard uniform. His second job was about to begin. Just 3 months ago, life had been different. David worked his factory job, came home tired but satisfied, spent evenings with his wife Linda and their daughter Sophie. They weren't rich, but they managed. Dinner was always on the table, bills were paid on time, and there was even a little left over for movie nights or the occasional pizza. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was comfortable. Then Sophie came home with news that changed everything. She had been accepted into Riverside Academy, one of the best private schools in the state. The letter praised her exceptional grades, her love for learning, and her potential. David remembered how his daughter's eyes had sparkled as she read the acceptance letter out loud. She was so proud, so hopeful. He and Linda had hugged her tight, celebrating this incredible achievement. But that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, David and Linda sat at the kitchen table staring at the financial paperwork. The tuition costs made David's stomach drop. Even with the partial scholarship Sophie had earned, they would need to come up with $15,000 a year. He did the math over and over, hoping somehow the numbers would change. They didn't. Linda worked at a local diner, pulling double shifts whenever she could. Between both their incomes, they could cover rent, utilities, food, and basic expenses. There was nothing left over. Not even close to what they needed for Sophie's tuition. David thought about loans, but the interest rates were crushing. He thought about asking family for help, but everyone was struggling in their own way. He thought about telling Sophie they couldn't afford it, but the image of her disappointed face was unbearable. That's when David made his decision. He wouldn't let money steal his daughter's future. He had always told Sophie that hard work opens doors, that education was the key to a better life. Now it was time to prove he meant it. If one job wasn't enough, he'd get two. Simple as that. Finding the night security job hadn't been difficult. A warehouse across town needed someone from midnight to 6 in the morning. The pay wasn't great, but combined with his factory wages, it would be enough. Just barely, but enough. David applied on a Monday, interviewed on Tuesday, and started training by Thursday. He didn't tell Sophie the full truth. She knew he was working hard, but he let her believe the factory had given him a promotion with better pay. No need to worry her with details. The first week nearly broke him. David would finish his factory shift at 11, drive 20 minutes to the warehouse, work security until 6 in the morning, then drive straight back to the factory for his 7 a.m. shift. He tried sleeping in his car during the commute, but those stolen minutes barely counted as rest. By Friday, he could barely keep his eyes open. His supervisor at the factory noticed him swaying at his station and pulled him aside, concerned. David lied, blaming it on a stomach bug. He promised he'd be fine. Linda knew the truth, of course. She watched her husband leave for his night shift with worry written all over her face. She begged him to reconsider, to find another way. But David was stubborn. He'd made his choice, and he was seeing it through. He asked her not to tell Sophie. Their daughter had enough pressure trying to keep up with her new school's demanding curriculum. She didn't need to carry the weight of her father's exhaustion, too. Sophie started at Riverside Academy in September, and David had never seen her so excited. She came home that first day bubbling with stories about the science lab, the library that had 3 floors of books, the computer room with brand new equipment. She talked about her teachers, her classmates, the possibilities that suddenly seemed within reach. Watching her enthusiasm made every sleepless hour worth it. But the exhaustion was real, and it was relentless. David developed a routine just to survive. He'd come home around 6:30 in the morning, shower quickly, and sit with Sophie while she ate breakfast before school. He'd ask about her homework, her friends, her day ahead. He'd smile and laugh and be present even though his body was shutting down. After she left for school at 7:15, he'd collapse into bed for exactly 90 minutes of sleep before his alarm yanked him back to consciousness. Then he'd dress and head to the factory. His lunch break became sacred sleeping time. While other workers ate in the cafeteria, David would find a quiet corner in his car, set an alarm, and pass out for 45 minutes. Those minutes of sleep were like gold. In the early evening, between his factory shift ending and his security shift starting, he'd grab another hour of rest if he was lucky. But it was never enough. Sleep debt accumulated like interest on a loan he could never quite pay off. The human body isn't designed to run on fumes forever. David's hands started shaking slightly, a tremor he couldn't quite control. His concentration slipped. Simple tasks took longer. He started drinking coffee by the pot, energy drinks by the case. The caffeine helped in the moment, but made it even harder to sleep during his brief windows of opportunity. Dark circles appeared under his eyes, so deep they looked like bruises. He lost weight because he was too tired to eat properly. But whenever Sophie looked at him, David made sure she saw strength, not exhaustion. He'd walk through the door with a smile, ask about her day, help with her homework. Math problems, science projects, history essays. He'd sit at the kitchen table working through problems with her, fighting to keep his eyes focused on the page. Sometimes Linda would watch from the doorway, her heart breaking for the man she loved, the father who refused to quit. Sophie was thriving. Her grades were excellent, and her teachers raved about her dedication. She joined the science club and the chess team. She made friends with kids from families wealthier than theirs, kids who lived in big houses and took vacations to Europe. But Sophie never seemed bothered by the difference. She was too focused on learning, on growing, on becoming everything she could be. And that, David thought, made every sacrifice worthwhile. On particularly brutal nights when David's body begged him to just go home and sleep, he'd think about why he was doing this. He thought about the opportunities Sophie would have that he never did. He thought about the doors that would open for her because of this education. He thought about the life she could build, the career she could have, the future that was possible because he was willing to go without sleep. David had grown up poor, really poor. He'd dropped out of school at 16 to help support his family when his own father got sick. He'd spent his whole life working manual labor jobs, watching people with education and opportunity pass him by. He'd made peace with his own limitations, but he refused to let those same limitations touch his daughter. Sophie was smart, talented, and driven. All she needed was a chance. And if staying awake for endless hours could give her that chance, then that's exactly what David would do. 3 months into his double-shift life, David caught his reflection in the warehouse bathroom mirror during one of his security rounds. He barely recognized himself. He looked 10 years older. But then he remembered Sophie's report card from her first quarter at Riverside. Straight A's. At the bottom, her teacher had written a note about what a joy Sophie was to have in class, how her curiosity and work ethic inspired other students. David folded that report card carefully and put it in his wallet. On the hardest nights when his body screamed for rest and his mind begged him to quit, he'd pull it out and read that teacher's note. Then he'd finish his shift, because that's what fathers do. They work, they sacrifice, they endure, not for recognition or thanks, but because love demands it. And David's love for his daughter was bigger than his exhaustion could ever be. 3 months turned into 6. 6 months became a year. 1 year stretched into 2, then 3. David's double shift routine stopped feeling like a temporary sacrifice and became his entire existence. This was his life now. Factory by day, security guard by night, a few scattered hours of sleep squeezed in between. His body adapted the way bodies do when they have no other choice. It learned to function on empty. But adaptation isn't the same as thriving. By Sophie's second year at Riverside Academy, the cracks in David's health were impossible to ignore. His hands didn't just shake anymore during moments of exhaustion. They trembled constantly, a fine vibration he couldn't control. He'd be holding his coffee cup at breakfast and watch the liquid ripple. He'd grip his pen to help Sophie with homework and see the ink line waver across the page. The headaches came next. Not the normal kind that disappear with aspirin and water. These were deep, pounding things that made his vision blur at the edges. They'd start around hour 18 of being awake and just build from there. Sometimes during his security rounds at 3 in the morning, David would have to stop and lean against a wall, waiting for the world to stop spinning. He'd close his eyes and count to 10, then force himself to keep moving. The warehouse was huge, and his boss expected him to check every section twice per shift. Linda watched her husband deteriorate and felt helpless. She tried everything to convince him to quit one job. She picked up extra shifts at the diner, working breakfasts and lunches and sometimes covering dinner rushes too. Her own body was paying the price. Her feet ached constantly from standing all day. Her back hurt from carrying heavy trays. She developed arthritis in her hands from years of gripping coffee pots and dish racks. But even with her extra hours, the money wasn't enough to replace David's second income. The math just didn't work. They had arguments about it. Quiet ones late at night when Sophie was asleep. Linda would beg David to stop before he killed himself. David would insist he was fine, that he just needed to push through until Sophie graduated. 4 years of this, he'd say. That's all. Just 4 years and then she'd be off to college with scholarships and opportunities. He could rest then. Linda would cry and David would hold her and nothing would change. Morning would come and he'd leave for the factory like always. Sophie noticed something was wrong, of course. She wasn't a child anymore. She was 14, then 15, then 16. She watched her father move slower, speak more carefully like forming words took extra effort. She saw how he'd fall asleep the moment he sat down on the couch. She noticed he'd lost weight, how his clothes hung looser on his frame. When she asked if he was okay, David always had an answer ready. Just tired from a busy week, coming down with something. Getting older, that's all. Nothing to worry about, but Sophie did worry. She started looking for ways to help with money. At 15, she got a part-time job at a bookstore near school. Minimum wage, working weekends and occasional evenings. Every paycheck went straight to her parents. David tried to refuse the money at first, but Sophie insisted. She was working too now, she said. She could contribute. It made her feel better to help, even though her small paychecks barely made a dent in the tuition costs. During Sophie's junior year, she also started tutoring younger students in math and science. $5 here, $10 there. She tutored kids in the library after school, helped them with algebra and chemistry and physics. Word spread that she was patient and good at explaining difficult concepts. Soon she had a steady stream of clients. She saved every dollar, kept it in an envelope in her desk drawer. When the envelope got full, she'd give it to her parents. For groceries, she'd say. For bills. David was proud of his daughter's work ethic, but it also broke his heart. She should be spending her weekends hanging out with friends, going to movies, being a teenager. Instead, she was working, trying to shoulder burdens that weren't hers to carry. He wanted to tell her to stop, to just focus on school and enjoy her youth. But they needed the money, and refusing her help felt like admitting defeat. So he thanked her, hugged her, and felt like he was failing as a father. The really bad night came during Sophie's junior year, on a Tuesday in October. David was doing his rounds at the warehouse, checking locks and scanning empty corridors. He'd been awake for 22 hours straight. His factory shift had been brutal, a rush order that meant everyone worked overtime. He'd gone straight to the warehouse without even a short nap in his car. His head pounded. His vision kept going fuzzy. He told himself he just needed to finish his rounds. Then he could sit in the security office for a bit. He was walking past the loading dock when his legs simply gave out. One moment he was upright, the next he was on the concrete floor. He didn't trip. He didn't stumble. His body just stopped working. David lay there, unable to move, staring at the warehouse ceiling. His heart hammered in his chest, beating so hard and so fast he thought it might explode. His left arm tingled. For a terrifying moment, he wondered if he was having a heart attack. His supervisor found him 20 minutes later, unconscious. The paramedics came, loaded David onto a stretcher, rushed him to the hospital. Linda got the call at 4 a.m. She woke Sophie, and they drove to the emergency room in silence, both of them scared of what they'd find. When they finally saw David, he was awake, hooked up to monitors, looking small and vulnerable in the hospital bed. The doctor's diagnosis was clear: severe exhaustion, dangerously high blood pressure, early signs of heart disease brought on by chronic stress and lack of sleep. The doctor asked David about his work schedule. When David explained the double shifts, the doctor's expression went from concern to angry. This was unsustainable, the doctor said. David was slowly killing himself. He needed rest, real rest, at least a month off work, maybe more. He needed to quit one of his jobs immediately. David listened to the doctor and nodded along, but Linda could see the stubbornness in her husband's eyes. He wasn't going to quit. Sophie sat in the corner of the hospital room, crying quietly. She'd never seen her father look so weak, so fragile. It scared her in a way nothing else ever had. Her dad was supposed to be strong, invincible. But lying in that hospital bed, he looked breakable. The hospital kept David for 2 days, running tests and adjusting medications. They sent him home with pills for his blood pressure and strict instructions to rest. David took a week off from both jobs, the first real time off he'd had in over 2 years. He slept for what felt like days. But even as his body recovered, his mind couldn't stop calculating. Every day he wasn't working was money they weren't earning. Sophie's tuition bill was due in 2 months. They were already cutting it close. Against the doctor's orders, against Linda's pleading, against his own body's warnings, David went back to both jobs. He promised to be more careful, to rest more, to take his medications regularly. He swore he'd listen to his body and stop if things got too bad. But everyone knew these were empty promises. David was going to keep working because that's who he was. A father who refused to give up on his daughter's future no matter what it cost him. Sophie's guilt ate at her. She started researching scholarships obsessively, applying for every single one she could find. Essay contests, science competitions, community service awards. She stayed up late writing applications, crafting personal statements, begging for financial help. Some nights, Linda would find her asleep at her desk, scholarship forms spread around her. The weight of her father's sacrifice pressed down on Sophie like a physical thing. By her senior year, Sophie had transformed that guilt into determination. She studied harder than anyone in her class. She took every advanced course available. She volunteered at a nursing home on weekends, joined the math team, led the science club. Her college applications were perfect. Her test scores were exceptional. She was building a future worthy of her father's sacrifice, even if the cost of that sacrifice terrified her. David watched his daughter excel and told himself it was worth it. Every award she won, every honor she received, every college acceptance letter that arrived justified his choices. At least that's what he told himself during the worst nights. When his chest hurt and his hands shook and his body begged for mercy, he'd pull out her report cards from his wallet and remind himself why he was doing this. For her, always for her, and somehow that made it possible to keep going, even when everything in him wanted to stop. Graduation day arrived on a perfect Saturday in June. The sun was shining. The sky was impossibly blue, and Riverside Academy's courtyard was filled with proud families and excited students. David sat in the audience wearing his only suit, the one he'd bought 15 years ago for his own wedding. It still fit, barely, though he'd lost so much weight that Linda had to take it in at the waist. His hands trembled as he held the program, but he didn't care. This was the moment he'd been working toward for 4 long years. Sophie was valedictorian, top of her class. When the principal announced her name, David's eyes filled with tears. He watched his daughter walk across the stage in her cap and gown, confident and poised, ready to give her speech. She looked so grown up, so capable, so ready for whatever came next. Every sleepless night, every aching muscle, every moment of exhaustion suddenly felt justified. This moment made it all worthwhile. Sophie's speech was beautiful. She talked about perseverance, about the importance of education, about chasing dreams no matter the obstacles. She thanked her teachers for pushing her to be better. She thanked her friends for supporting her through the challenging years. And then she turned to where her parents sat in the audience. Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke about her mom and dad, about their unwavering support and endless encouragement. David wiped his eyes, trying not to sob openly in front of hundreds of people. After the ceremony ended, the courtyard became chaos. Students hugged, parents took photos, teachers congratulated their graduates. David stood near the refreshment table, fighting to keep his eyes open. He'd worked his overnight security shift as usual, not wanting to call in sick even for his daughter's graduation. He'd been awake for almost 24 hours straight, running on coffee and adrenaline and sheer willpower. Linda kept glancing at him with concern, but David waved her off. He could make it a few more hours. He had to. Sophie was somewhere in the crowd taking photos with her friends and teachers. David scanned the faces looking for her, wanting to give her the biggest hug of her life. That's when a tall man in an expensive suit approached him. The man smiled and extended his hand. David shook it, confused about who this stranger was. "You must be so proud," the man said warmly. 4 years of night shifts paying off, huh?" David's smile froze. His brain, foggy from exhaustion, tried to process what he'd just heard. Night shifts. This man knew about the night shifts, but how? David didn't recognize him at all. "I'm Robert Mitchell," the man continued, oblivious to David's growing panic. "I manage the warehouse where you work security. We've never actually met since I work days and you work nights, but I've heard great things about you from the supervisors. When I saw Sophie's name in the program as valedictorian, I put two and two together. Same last name, and you'd mentioned your daughter going to Riverside when you first started. Small world. David's heart sank into his stomach. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. Behind Robert, he saw Sophie pushing through the crowd toward them. She'd heard her name. She was coming over. Robert, still completely unaware of the bomb he'd just dropped, kept talking. 4 years is a long time to work overnight. Most people quit after a few months. But you stuck it out. That's dedication. Your daughter's lucky to have a father willing to sacrifice like that. Sophie reached them just as Robert finished speaking. Her smile was radiant, glowing with pride and happiness. Dad, I've been looking everywhere for you. I want to get photos with you and Mom before everyone leaves. Then she noticed Robert and her expression shifted to polite curiosity. Oh, hi, I'm Sophie. Robert Mitchell, the man said, shaking her hand enthusiastically. I manage the warehouse where your father works. I was just telling him how impressed I am that he stuck with the night security job for all 4 years of your high school. Not many people have that kind of commitment. The change in Sophie's face was instant and devastating. Her smile vanished. The color drained from her cheeks. She looked at Robert, then at her father, then back at Robert. Night security job, she repeated slowly, like she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. What night security job? Robert's expression shifted from friendly to horrified as he realized his mistake. Oh no. I assumed she knew. He looked at David with wide, apologetic eyes. David felt like he was going to be sick. 4 years of carefully maintained lies crumbling in seconds. He'd been so close to keeping it secret until Sophie left for college. So close, Dad? Sophie's voice was small now, confused. What is he talking about? Robert backed away, mumbling apologies, clearly desperate to escape the situation he'd accidentally created. David watched him disappear into the crowd, then forced himself to look at his daughter. Her eyes were searching his face, looking for an explanation that would make sense. Let's not do this here, David said quietly, glancing around at the happy families celebrating nearby. Let's talk at home. No, Sophie's voice was firm. Tell me now. What night security job? Linda appeared at David's side, taking in the scene instantly. She'd always known this moment would come eventually. You can't keep secrets forever. She put a hand on her husband's arm, offering support but staying silent. This was David's truth to tell, so David told her. Right there in the courtyard, surrounded by celebrating graduates and proud parents, he explained everything. The night shifts at the warehouse from midnight to 6 in the morning. The way he'd go straight from security to the factory every single day. The hospital collapse, the doctor's warnings, the medications he took to keep his heart from giving out, all of it. Sophie listened in complete silence, her face going through a series of emotions: shock, disbelief, confusion, and then devastatingly, guilt. Her eyes filled with tears that spilled down her cheeks, smudging her carefully applied makeup. 4 years? She whispered. You've been working 2 jobs for 4 years? That's why you're always so tired. That's why you fell asleep at my debate competitions. That's why. She pressed her hands to her face, shoulders shaking. Oh my God, Dad, your health. The hospital. That was because of me. No, David said firmly, reaching for her. Don't you dare think that. This was my choice, my decision. You didn't ask for any of this. But Sophie stepped back, shaking her head. The tuition. You did this to pay my tuition. All those times I complained about wanting new clothes or going out with friends, and you were literally working yourself to death to keep me in that school. Her voice broke completely. How could you not tell me? Because you didn't need to know, David said, his own voice rough with emotion. Your job was to study and learn and become everything you're capable of being. My job was to make that possible. That's what parents do, Sophie. We sacrifice for our kids. A small crowd had started to gather, other families noticing the emotional scene. Linda gently guided David and Sophie toward a quieter corner of the courtyard, away from curious eyes. Sophie was crying openly now, not bothering to wipe the tears away. I could have gone to public school, she sobbed. I could have worked more hours. I could have taken out loans. There were so many other options, and instead you destroyed your health for me. And I'd do it again, David said without hesitation. He was crying too now, tears streaming down his tired face. Sophie, look at what you've accomplished. Full scholarship to MIT, valedictorian. You have opportunities I never dreamed of. That's worth every sleepless night, every single one." Sophie threw her arms around her father, holding him tight. She could feel how thin he'd become, how fragile he seemed compared to the strong dad she remembered from childhood. She'd been so focused on school, on grades, on her own future that she'd missed what was happening right in front of her. Her father had been slowly breaking down and she'd been too blind to see it. They stood there for a long time, father and daughter, both crying in each other's arms. Other graduates and families passed by, some glancing over with curiosity or concern, but David and Sophie didn't notice. The rest of the world had faded away. It was just the two of them in this moment of truth, this moment of realization, this moment when Sophie finally understood the true cost of her success. When they finally pulled apart, Sophie looked her father in the eyes. Her face was red and blotchy from crying, her makeup completely ruined, but her expression was determined. "I'm going to pay you back," she said fiercely. "I don't know how yet, but I promise you, Dad. I'm going to take care of you the way you took care of me." David smiled through his tears and cupped his daughter's face in his trembling hands. "You don't owe me anything, sweetheart. Your success is all the payment I need." But Sophie shook her head. "No, you gave me 4 years of your life, 4 years of your health, and I'm going to spend the rest of mine making sure you never have to work that hard again." In that moment, something shifted between them. The relationship between parent and child transformed into something new. Sophie was no longer just his little girl. She was a young woman making a solemn promise, a vow she intended to keep. And David, looking into his daughter's determined eyes, believed her. The future suddenly looked different than he'd imagined. Perhaps his sacrifice hadn't just given Sophie an education. Perhaps it had taught her something even more valuable: the meaning of love, commitment, and the beautiful weight of responsibility we carry for the people who matter most. Sophie arrived at MIT that fall with a fire burning inside her that wouldn't go out. Every other freshman seemed excited about parties, football games, and newfound freedom. Sophie had different priorities. She was there for one reason only: to build a future big enough to take care of the people who had sacrificed everything for her. Her roommate thought she was crazy. While other students stayed up late socializing, Sophie stayed up late studying. While others slept in on weekends, Sophie was in the library by 7 in the morning. She took the maximum course load allowed, sometimes petitioning for permission to take extra classes. Every assignment wasn't just homework. It was a step toward the promise she'd made to her father on graduation day. The biomedical engineering program was brutal. Students dropped out regularly, switching to easier majors or transferring to less demanding schools. Sophie thrived on the difficulty. Fluid dynamics, biomechanics, medical device design. She absorbed everything like someone starving for knowledge. When professors posted optional problem sets, Sophie completed every single one. When they mentioned interesting research papers, she read them that night. She wasn't just trying to pass. She was trying to dominate. Her grades reflected her dedication. Perfect scores in nearly every class. Her professors started noticing her, remembering her name, asking if she'd considered graduate school. But Sophie had no interest in more years of study. She needed to start earning. Real money, the kind of money that could change lives. Her father was still working both jobs despite her begging him to quit. Every phone call home, she could hear the exhaustion in his voice. It pushed her to work even harder. During her sophomore year, Sophie started applying for internships. Not just any internships. She targeted the biggest medical device companies in the country, the ones that paid interns like full employees. She spent weeks perfecting her resume, her cover letters, her portfolio. When interview invitations came, she prepared obsessively. She researched every company inside and out, memorized their products, understood their markets. She practiced answering questions in the mirror until her responses sounded natural and confident. She landed an internship at Cardiotech, one of the leading cardiac device manufacturers. The pay was incredible for an intern, $15,000 for 3 months of summer work. Sophie signed the offer letter with tears in her eyes. This money could give her father a break. Maybe he could finally quit the warehouse job, at least for the summer. But David refused to take the money. He was proud of Sophie's achievement, proud that she'd earned such a prestigious position. But that money was hers, he insisted. She should save it for graduate school, or put it toward her future. Sophie argued with him for hours over the phone, but her father was as stubborn as ever. Finally, Sophie gave up arguing. She deposited the money into a savings account and didn't touch it. This was the beginning of her plan. The internship changed everything for Sophie. She wasn't just learning theory anymore. She was seeing how the real world worked, how business operated, how money flowed. She watched senior engineers who'd been working for 20 years, saw their salaries, their lifestyles, their opportunities. She realized that if she played her cards right, if she worked hard enough, she could reach that level in half the time. She networked relentlessly. She made herself invaluable to her supervisor, staying late, volunteering for extra projects, asking questions that showed she was thinking beyond her assigned tasks. When the internship ended, her boss pulled her aside. They wanted her back next summer, he said. And when she graduated, there would be a full-time position waiting for her if she wanted it. Sophie returned to MIT for her junior year with a clear path forward. She doubled down on her studies, taking even more advanced courses. She joined research projects with professors, getting her name on papers that would be published in academic journals. She competed in engineering competitions, winning awards that looked impressive on a resume. Every achievement was strategic, calculated to make her the most attractive candidate possible when graduation came. Her social life was essentially non-existent. While her roommate went on dates and joined sorority events, Sophie spent Friday nights in the engineering lab. While other students traveled during spring break, Sophie took online courses to learn programming languages that would make her more valuable to employers. Her roommate eventually stopped inviting her to things, assuming Sophie would say no anyway. Sophie didn't mind. She had a goal, and everything else was just distraction. The summer after her junior year, she interned at MedTech Solutions, an even bigger company than Cardiotech. They paid her $22,000 for 3 months. Again, she deposited every penny into her growing savings account. She lived cheap that summer, finding a tiny room to rent, eating ramen and peanut butter sandwiches, walking everywhere to save on transportation. Her coworkers thought she was odd, but Sophie didn't care what they thought. Senior year arrived and Sophie's reputation preceded her. Companies recruited her aggressively. Multiple job offers came in before she even graduated. She negotiated hard, using each offer to leverage better terms from others. When the dust settled, she'd accepted a position at Biogenesis Corporation, one of the top medical technology firms in the nation. The starting salary was $95,000. For a kid who'd grown up watching her parents struggle to pay rent, the number seemed impossible. Sophie graduated summa cum laude, top of her engineering class. David and Linda drove up for the ceremony, and this time Sophie made sure there were no secrets between them. She told them about the job, the salary, her plans. David cried again, but this time from joy and pride rather than exhaustion. His daughter had made it. Everything he'd worked for had come true. Sophie started her job in July, moving to Boston where Biogenesis had its headquarters. The other new hires, fresh out of college with big salaries, immediately started spending money. New cars, nice apartments, expensive clothes, fancy restaurants. Sophie watched them with quiet amusement. They didn't understand. This money wasn't for enjoying. It was for a purpose. She found a tiny apartment in a rough neighborhood, splitting a 2-bedroom with 3 other roommates. Her room barely fit a bed and a desk. Her coworkers were shocked when they found out where she lived. On her salary, she could afford a nice place in a good neighborhood. Why was she living like a broke college student? Sophie just smiled and changed the subject. They didn't need to know her plans. Every paycheck, Sophie did the same thing. She paid her minimal living expenses. Food, rent, basic necessities. Everything else went straight into savings and investments. She started learning about the stock market, about index funds, about building wealth. She read books on personal finance, watched videos about investing, consulted with financial advisors. Her savings account grew rapidly, but saving wasn't enough. Sophie started taking on side work, consulting projects with smaller companies who needed engineering expertise but couldn't afford full-time employees. She'd work her regular job during the day, then come home and work on consulting projects at night, just like her father had done, working 2 jobs. But Sophie's 2 jobs paid exponentially more than factory work and warehouse security. The consulting money was pure profit and it all went into savings. Her co-workers thought she was crazy. Why work so hard when she was already successful? Why live like she was poor when she was earning good money? Some of them started avoiding her, thinking she was obsessed or weird. Sophie didn't care. She had friends from MIT she stayed in touch with. She had her parents who she called every week. She didn't need workplace friendships. She needed money. 3 years passed. Sophie got promoted twice, each time negotiating hard for higher salaries. She became known as one of the sharpest young engineers in the company, someone who solved problems others couldn't. Her reputation grew. Headhunters called regularly, trying to poach her for even higher salaries at competing firms. Sophie leveraged these offers into better compensation at Biogenesis. Every raise, every bonus, every stock option went straight into her growing investment portfolio. She lived the same way she had since college. Cheap apartment, basic food, minimal expenses. She wore the same clothes for years, bought generic brands at the grocery store, never took vacations. Her bank account grew larger and larger. 50,000, 75,000, 100,000 more. She watched the numbers climb with grim satisfaction. She was getting closer. Meanwhile, back home, David had finally quit his warehouse job. The collapse 3 years earlier had scared him enough that he listened to his doctors somewhat. He still worked at the factory, but at least he was sleeping at night now. His health had stabilized, though the damage from those 4 years couldn't be completely undone. He took medications for his heart, for his blood pressure, for the chronic pain in his joints. He was only 55 but felt 20 years older. Linda had also cut back her hours at the diner. Her arthritis had gotten so bad that some days she could barely hold a coffee pot. They were getting by on less money, living more carefully, but at least they were both getting proper rest. Sophie sent them money every month, more than they needed, but they usually sent most of it back. They hadn't sacrificed so much just to become a burden on their daughter, they insisted. Sophie never told them how much she was really making or how much she'd saved. She didn't tell them about the consulting work or the growing investment portfolio. She answered their questions vaguely, saying work was going well, she was comfortable, everything was fine. She visited home 4 times a year, always acting like nothing special was happening, just a regular daughter with a regular job living a regular life. But there was nothing regular about what Sophie was building. She had a plan, detailed and specific. She'd worked out every number, every timeline, every detail. She knew exactly how much money she needed and how long it would take to get there. She was almost ready. Just a little bit longer. Just a few more months of sacrifice, of grinding, of living below her means while banking every possible dollar. Her father had given her 4 years of sleepless nights. Sophie was giving him 3 years of calculated discipline. Soon, very soon, it would be time to return the favor, and when that moment came, when she could finally reveal what she'd been working toward, David would understand that his sacrifice hadn't just changed his daughter's life. It had set in motion something much bigger. A circle of love and commitment that was about to come full turn in the most beautiful way possible. David turned 58 on a Tuesday in March. He hadn't made a big deal about it. Birthdays had never been important to him, and this one felt like any other day. He went to work at the factory, came home tired like always, ate the dinner Linda had prepared, and settled onto the couch to watch television. Just another ordinary evening in an ordinary life. Then Sophie called. She asked if both her parents could be home Saturday afternoon. She was driving down for a visit and had something important to discuss. David felt a flutter of worry. Important discussions usually meant problems. Maybe Sophie was having trouble at work. Maybe she needed money. Maybe something was wrong. Linda assured him they were probably worrying over nothing, but David couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Saturday arrived cold and gray, typical March weather. David kept glancing at the clock, watching the minutes tick toward 2 in the afternoon when Sophie had said she'd arrive. Linda cleaned the house nervously, dusting surfaces that were already clean, rearranging pillows that didn't need rearranging. They were both anxious, though neither wanted to admit it. Sophie's car pulled into the driveway exactly at 2. She'd always been punctual, organized, precise. David watched from the window as his daughter climbed out, pulling a leather briefcase from the passenger seat. A briefcase. That made him even more nervous. What kind of conversation required a briefcase? She hugged them both at the door, and David studied her face looking for clues. She seemed calm, almost excited. Not upset or worried. That was good, at least. They settled in the living room, Sophie sitting in the armchair across from her parents on the couch. She placed the briefcase on the coffee table between them but didn't open it immediately. "So," Linda said, unable to stand the suspense any longer. "What's this about, honey?" You said it was important. Sophie took a deep breath. Her hands were shaking slightly, David noticed. She was nervous too, despite her calm exterior. I need to talk to you about something I've been working on for the past 3 years. Since I graduated, actually. David's worry intensified. 3 years of secret work didn't sound good. Linda reached over and squeezed his hand. Sophie continued, her voice steady but emotional. Dad, do you remember my graduation day? When you told me about the night shifts, about working 2 jobs for 4 years to pay my tuition? David nodded. How could he forget? That had been one of the most difficult conversations of his life. I made you a promise that day, Sophie said. I told you I was going to take care of you the way you took care of me. Do you remember? Sophie, you don't owe us anything. David started, but she held up her hand to stop him. Please, let me finish. She opened the briefcase and pulled out a folder. Her hands were definitely shaking now. You worked 2 jobs for 4 years. You sacrificed your sleep, your health, your peace of mind. You did it without complaining, without asking for recognition, without expecting anything in return. You did it because you loved me and wanted me to have opportunities you never had. Tears were forming in Sophie's eyes, but she blinked them back. Well, I've spent the last 3 years working toward something too. I've been living in a tiny apartment with roommates, eating cheap food, not taking vacations, working extra consulting jobs at night. My co-workers thought I was crazy. Some of them still do. But I had a goal just like you had a goal. She opened the folder and pulled out several documents. I can't give you back those 4 years of sleepless nights. I can't undo the damage to your heart or take away the chronic pain you live with now. But I can give you something else. I can give you security. I can give you peace. I can give you the rest you've earned. Sophie slid the first document across the coffee table. David picked it up with trembling hands, Linda leaning over to read with him. It was a deed. A property deed for a house. Their names were listed as the owners. That's a 3-bedroom house in Riverside, Sophie explained. Good neighborhood, quiet street, near the park you always said you loved. It's fully paid for. No mortgage. No monthly payments. It's yours. David couldn't speak. He stared at the document, reading the words over and over, unable to process what he was seeing. Linda had started crying, her hand pressed to her mouth. Sophie pulled out more papers. This is a health insurance policy. Premium coverage, everything included. All your medications, all your doctor visits, any procedures you need. It's paid for the next 10 years. After that, it'll roll into your Medicare and supplement whatever that doesn't cover. More papers. These are investment accounts. They're in both your names. The money is invested conservatively, generating steady income. It should give you about $4,000 a month, adjusted for inflation. That's in addition to your Social Security when you start taking it. David tried to speak, but no words came out. His brain couldn't comprehend what was happening. Sophie kept pulling out papers, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. And these are retirement letters, pre-written, addressed to your bosses. All you have to do is sign them. She looked at her father directly, tears now streaming down her face. Dad, you're retiring today, right now. No more factory. Mom, no more diner. You've both worked hard enough. You've sacrificed enough. It's over. The room fell silent except for Linda's quiet sobbing. David sat frozen, the papers scattered across his lap, trying to understand how this was possible. How had his daughter done this? Where had the money come from? I don't understand, he finally managed to say. How did you? Where did? I saved everything, Sophie said simply. Every penny I could. I lived cheap, worked extra jobs, invested smart. I've been planning this since graduation day. I told you I was going to take care of you, and I meant it. David shook his head, overwhelmed. Sophie, this is too much. This must have cost. I can't even imagine. You should use this money for yourself. For your future. For a house of your own. I have a future, Sophie said firmly. I have a good job, I'm healthy, I have time to build my own life. You gave me that future, Dad. You paid for it with 4 years of your life. Now it's my turn. You taught me that family takes care of family. You taught me that sacrifice is what love looks like. Well, this is what my love looks like. She leaned forward, her voice breaking. You worked nights so I could have bright days. You stayed awake so I could dream. Now I want you to rest. Really rest. I want you to wake up when your body is ready. Not when an alarm clock screams. I want you to take walks in that park near your new house. I want Mom's hands to heal without having to hold heavy trays all day. I want you both to have the life you gave up so I could have mine. David couldn't hold back anymore. He broke down completely, deep sobs shaking his whole body. Linda was crying too, and then Sophie was crying, and soon all three of them were holding each other in the middle of the living room, years of sacrifice and love and gratitude flowing out in tears. When they finally pulled apart, David wiped his eyes and looked at his daughter. Really looked at her. She wasn't his little girl anymore. She was a force of nature, a young woman who'd turned her father's sacrifice into her own mission. She'd spent 3 years living like she was poor so her parents could live comfortably. She'd worked 2 jobs just like he had, except she'd done it to give rather than to receive. "You didn't have to do this," David whispered. "Yes, I did," Sophie replied. "You taught me how." They spent the rest of the afternoon going through the paperwork, Sophie explaining everything she'd arranged. The house was move-in ready, furniture included. She'd set up automatic payments for utilities and property taxes from the investment accounts. She'd thought of everything, planned for every detail. Nothing was left to chance. Linda kept asking if Sophie was sure, if she wouldn't need this money later, if she wasn't sacrificing too much. Sophie assured them she was fine. She'd kept enough for herself, had a solid emergency fund, was still earning good money. This hadn't left her broke. It had just required discipline and planning. As the sun began to set, David signed the retirement letters with a hand that still trembled, but now from emotion rather than exhaustion. 58 years old, and he was done working. He'd started working at 15, 43 years of manual labor, and now it was over. The relief was so overwhelming he could barely breathe. That night, David stood in the kitchen of their new house, Sophie having insisted they at least come see it before she drove back to Boston. He looked out the window at the quiet street, the tall trees, the peaceful neighborhood. Linda was in the living room crying happy tears as she explored their new home. Sophie stood beside her father and he put his arm around her shoulders. "I'm so proud of you," he said quietly. "Not because of this, though this is incredible. I'm proud of the person you've become. You're kind and generous and strong. You could have kept all that money for yourself and no one would have blamed you. But you chose to give it to us instead." Sophie leaned her head on her father's shoulder. "You gave me everything, Dad. Your time, your health, your strength. Money is easy compared to what you sacrificed. I just had to be smart and patient. You had to be exhausted and in pain. My sacrifice doesn't even come close to yours." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed 7. Usually at this hour, David would be fighting sleep, trying to stay awake for a few more hours before collapsing into bed. Tonight he was wide awake, energized by possibility rather than drained by obligation. "What will you do now?" Sophie asked. "With all this free time?" David smiled, really smiled, for what felt like the first time in years. "I think I'll sleep. Maybe for a week straight. And then I'll take your mother on that vacation we've been talking about for 20 years. And then I'll sit in that park you mentioned and just watch the world go by. I'll do all the things I never had time for." Sophie hugged him tight. "You deserve all of that and more." As she drove back to Boston that night, Sophie felt lighter than she had in 3 years. The mission was complete. The promise was kept. Her father would rest, her mother would heal, and the sacrifice that had started with sleepless nights in a warehouse had transformed into peaceful days in a quiet house. The circle was complete. Love had flowed from father to daughter and back again, growing stronger with each pass. And in the end, both had learned the same beautiful truth, that the greatest joy comes not from what we receive, but from what we're able to give to the people who matter most.